Hello everyone. In the architecture of the psyche, as Carl Jung envisioned it, the ego holds a central yet limited role. It is the seat of consciousness, the part of us that says I, that navigates the external world, and that attempts to establish order through reason and control. But the ego is not the totality of the self. It is a small island surrounded by a vast and mysterious ocean. The unconscious. Overthinking arises precisely when this relationship between ego and unconscious becomes strained, imbalanced, or altogether severed. It is a symptom of the ego attempting to dominate the psychic system rather than listening to the deeper rhythms of the soul. The modern mind is heavily burdened with the illusion that everything can be resolved through conscious effort. We are taught from early on that problems are to be solved by thinking them through, that logic and analysis are the supreme tools of progress. This belief, though useful in some domains, becomes pathological when applied to the deeper, emotional and symbolic life of the psyche. Overthinking emerges when the ego, disconnected from the unconscious, begins to spiral inward, repeating questions, rehearsing fears, revisiting regrets, and imagining future scenarios as though they can be controlled or perfected through sheer thought. This compulsive thought is not thought in its truest sense. It is not reflective or integrative. It is defensive. It is an anxious movement of the ego that seeks to prevent emotional discomfort by retreating into mental activity. But the psyche does not work this way. What is avoided on the emotional or symbolic level does not disappear. It is merely repressed, and that repression creates tension between the conscious and unconscious realms, which manifests as intrusive thoughts, anxiety, and inner conflict. Overthinking, therefore, is not the mind's strength, but its suffering. It is a cry for balance from a soul that is being neglected. Jung taught that the psyche is a self-regulating system. When one part becomes overdeveloped or dominant, the other parts push back, often unconsciously. In the case of overthinking, the ego becomes inflated with its own importance. It forgets that it is only one function among many. It attempts to outthink feeling, to suppress intuition, to override the instinctive knowing of the body. But this creates a psychic bottleneck. The energy of the unconscious has nowhere to flow, so it returns in distorted forms. Circular thoughts, sleeplessness, neurosis. The more the ego tightens its grip, the more the unconscious resists, and the result is a kind of internal warfare. This warfare is often invisible to the outer world. The overthinker may appear calm, thoughtful, even intelligent, but within there is turbulence. The thoughts are not serving consciousness, they are consuming it. The individual is trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every thought leads to another, and nothing ever resolves. This is not insight. It is inertia. The mind is moving, but it is not progressing. It is like a wheel spinning in mud, burning energy but going nowhere. This is the suffering that so many endure in silence, believing that if they just think a little more, they will be free. But freedom does not come from more thought. It comes from restoring the rightful relationship between the ego and the unconscious. Jung did not advocate for the abandonment of the ego. He saw it as a necessary structure, but it must be humble. It must recognize that it is not the master of the house, but a steward. It must learn to listen to the unconscious, to dreams, to symbols, to the voice of the shadow. Overthinking occurs when the ego refuses this dialogue. It tries to solve what must be felt, control what must be accepted, and understand what must be experienced. In many cases, overthinking is a defense against descent. The descent into the unconscious is not comfortable. It brings us face to face with our wounds, our fears, our repressed desires, and unacceptable truths. The ego, fearing dissolution, clings to the safety of rational thought, but in doing so, it isolates itself. It becomes brittle, inflexible, and ultimately overwhelmed. The unconscious does not go away simply because we ignore it. On the contrary, it becomes more insistent, the thoughts become louder, the anxiety increases, the dreams become disturbing. These are not failures, they are invitations. They are the soul calling for wholeness. To address overthinking from a Jungian perspective, we must go beyond cognitive strategies. We must enter into a symbolic relationship with our inner world. We must ask what the thoughts are protecting us from, what feelings lie beneath them, what archetypal energies are at play. We must learn to tolerate not knowing, to sit with ambiguity, to allow silence to speak. The healing does not come from solving the problem, but from integrating the parts of the self that have been neglected. Overthinking is a signal that we have lost touch with the deeper wisdom of the psyche. It is not a flaw, but a message. And like all messages from the unconscious, it will not be silenced until it has been heard. The ego must step down from its throne and enter into a sacred dialogue with the unknown. Only then can thought become a servant of the soul rather than its jailer. The human psyche, in its longing for order and understanding, often falls prey to the illusion that certainty is safety. In the overactive mind of the modern individual, the ego desperately clings to control as a safeguard against chaos. This is not an abstract notion, but a deeply felt truth in the unconscious terrain of the soul. The ego, believing itself to be the totality of the self, attempts to construct a secure world through analysis, planning, and rational anticipation. But life is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a mystery to be lived, and the ego, in its fear of surrender, forgets this fundamental truth. It cannot tolerate the unknown, and so it creates the illusion that if we think long enough, we can overcome it. At the heart of overthinking lies this resistance to surrender, a refusal to relinquish control, not just of situations, but of outcomes, emotions, and identity itself. The overthinker does not merely reflect. They obsess. They return repeatedly to scenarios, conversations, and imagined futures not because they seek clarity, but because they fear vulnerability. To let go would mean to admit uncertainty, to step into the unpredictable flow of life where answers are not given in advance. For the ego, this is intolerable. It would rather remain trapped in a labyrinth of thought than risk the surrender that true transformation requires. This fear of surrender is not rooted in weakness, but in the psyche's attempt to protect itself from perceived annihilation. For many, the unconscious holds memories of pain, moments where surrender led to harm, where trust was betrayed, or where helplessness was experienced as a deep psychic wound. The ego, in response, constructs an armor made of thought. Overthinking becomes a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the rawness of emotion, the unpredictability of life, and the depths of the unconscious. It creates the illusion of control, even as it deepens our suffering. But the unconscious cannot be controlled by force. It does not yield to logic or demand. It speaks in symbols, images, and feelings. When the ego refuses to listen to this language, it becomes deaf to the inner world. It becomes a tyrant, trying to impose order on a reality that is inherently fluid and alive. In this state, the mind becomes hyperactive, not because it is wise, but because it is afraid. The thoughts multiply, not to bring insight, but to maintain distance from the deeper currents of the self. Overthinking, then, is not a sign of intelligence, but of disconnection. It signals that the ego has forgotten its place within the great totality of the psyche. Jung understood that healing does not come through dominance, but through integration. The ego must learn to relate to the unconscious as a partner, not as an adversary. It must be willing to relinquish its illusion of mastery and descend into the inner world with humility. This descent is terrifying for the ego, because it must face the truth that it is not in control. It must face the reality of its own limitations, but this is not a death, it is a rebirth. In surrendering control, the ego opens the door to a deeper kind of wisdom, one that cannot be grasped, only received. Overthinking prevents this surrender. It keeps the psyche in a state of constant vigilance, as though thinking enough can prevent pain, avoid failure, or secure love. But love, like life, cannot be secured by thought. It can only be entered into with presence and vulnerability. The overthinking mind is a mind in exile. It longs for connection, but fears the surrender that connection requires. It searches for safety in analysis, never realizing that safety comes not from control, but from wholeness. And wholeness demands that we accept the unknown, the uncontrollable, and the mysterious dimensions of being. The path forward is not to eradicate thought, but to transform its role. The mind must become a tool in service to the self, not a fortress to protect the ego. No. To do this, one must cultivate practices that invite surrender, silence, solitude, dreams, art, deep feeling. These are not escapes from thinking, but doorways to the deeper psyche. They soften the ego's grip and allow the unconscious to speak. In this dialogue, the compulsive need to overthink begins to dissolve. We come to see that the answers we seek are not always found through effort, but through openness. The fear of surrender is the fear of being undone, of losing control, of not knowing. But the true self is not destroyed in surrender. It is revealed. What the ego fears as chaos is often the soul's invitation to growth. Overthinking is a wall we build to keep that invitation out. But the wall does not protect us, it imprisons us. The moment we allow ourselves to not know, to not control, to simply be with what is, this is the moment we return to the flow of life. The mind quiets, not because everything is resolved, but because the ego is no longer alone. It has remembered that it is part of something greater, something deeper, something sacred. The compulsion to overthink is often seen as a flaw of logic or an error of excessive intellectual engagement, but this is a surface interpretation. Beneath the restless churn of thought, there lies a deeper psychic wound, one that speaks not of intellect but of pain. In the language of depth psychology, overthinking can be understood not merely as a habit, but as a defense mechanism, a form of psychic armor crafted in response to emotional injury. It arises from trauma, whether great or small, where the individual learned that the world was not safe, where uncertainty brought chaos, where feelings were overwhelming and no reliable caregiver was present to help contain them. The mind, in its brilliance, adapted by thinking, strategizing, anticipating, analyzing, not for growth but for survival. Trauma fragments the self. It interrupts the natural integration of emotion, intuition, and thought. In a traumatic environment, especially during early developmental stages, the child may come to perceive emotional expression as dangerous, irrational, or shameful. As a result, the ego distances itself from the feeling realm and retreats into the intellect. This retreat is not a conscious choice, but an unconscious adaptation to a psychic environment that offers no room for vulnerability. Over time, this retreat becomes a default mode. The mind becomes hypervigilant, always scanning for danger, always preparing for what might go wrong. This is not thinking in the philosophical sense. It is calculating, bracing, rehearsing, and controlling. It is the psyche's attempt to preempt threat in a world it has learned to fear. Jung recognized that many neurotic symptoms were rooted not in some inherent defect, but in a soul that had been wounded and was trying to heal itself in the only way it knew how. Overthinking, then, is not senseless. It is a brilliant, though maladaptive, solution to psychic. In the depths of overthinking lies a profound avoidance of emotion, a resistance to feeling what the ego deems too overwhelming or unsafe to touch. The modern mind, shaped by performance and perfection, clings to thought as a form of control, while quietly disconnecting from the very emotions that give life color, meaning, and wholeness. When we begin to observe the habit of overthinking, it becomes apparent that it often activates in the presence of difficult emotions: sadness, anger, guilt, envy, grief, or vulnerability. These feelings, instead of being processed in the body, are quickly redirected into mental loops. Rather than allow ourselves to feel deeply, we retreat into cognition, believing, falsely, that thinking can protect us from emotional pain. The psyche does not tolerate emptiness well. When there is emotional energy within us that remains unacknowledged, it doesn't disappear. It transforms into mental agitation. A thought is often not just a thought, it is an emotion trying to speak. But in a society where emotional expression is often judged as irrational or weak, we have learned to bypass feeling in favor of rationality. We are taught to solve problems rather than sit with them, to analyze rather than empathize, to move forward rather than turn inward. This cultural posture shapes the ego in such a way that thinking becomes a way of escaping the body. The body, which holds memory, trauma, and intuition, becomes a foreign place. The heart becomes distant. And over time, the disconnection deepens into anxiety, rumination, and restlessness, all of which are symptoms of unprocessed emotional life. Jung observed that neuroses are often the result of a split between the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche. Overthinking is a prime example of this divide. The conscious mind tries to dominate experience through logic and control, while the unconscious, the emotional, intuitive, symbolic realm is silenced, but it does not remain silent. It communicates through symptoms, through dreams, through compulsions, through somatic distress. When the unconscious is ignored, it retaliates not out of malice but in an effort to restore balance. The psyche longs for integration. The mind and the heart must come into relationship. Until this happens, thought will remain hyperactive, not because we are deep thinkers, but because we are emotionally exiled. To understand overthinking as emotional avoidance is to radically change how we engage with it. Rather than attacking the mind for its noise, we must learn to listen to the feelings beneath the noise. Every loop of analysis, every imaginary argument, every what-if scenario is pointing toward something unfelt. And what remains unfelt cannot be healed. The path to quieting the mind is not to think better thoughts, but to create space for emotional honesty. This means cultivating a relationship with the body. It means slowing down enough to notice what is present underneath the mental chatter. What are we afraid to feel? What are we trying to solve instead of grieve? What truth are we afraid will rise if the mind goes still? This is not an easy path. Emotions that have been avoided for years or decades can feel overwhelming when they surface. The mind may resist with greater force, returning to overthinking with urgency, but this is not regression. It is a sign that the work is taking effect. As we begin to feel more, we also think less compulsively. The two are intimately linked. Emotional processing allows the psyche to relax. When grief is acknowledged, when anger is felt and expressed constructively, when fear is named and comforted, the mind no longer needs to run interference. The nervous system settles. The body comes out of defense, and the thoughts begin to slow, not by force, but by grace. What Jung offered us was not a method to eliminate suffering, but a framework to make suffering meaningful. We become stuck in the ego's limited perception rather than surrendering to the broader intelligence of the psyche. We stop listening to dreams, to intuition, to synchronicities. We trade symbolic understanding for literal interpretation, and in doing so, we lose contact with the very source of inner guidance. This compulsion to control is also deeply connected to our relationship with time. Overthinking almost always takes us out of the present moment. It drags us into the past with regret, into the future with anxiety. The present becomes a transit zone for the mind, never a place to rest. Yet it is only in the present that healing occurs. The unconscious communicates in present time, through images, sensations, emotions, impulses. When we live in the mind, we live in abstraction. When we return to the body, we return to reality. Control is an illusion sustained by avoidance of presence. But presence demands that we feel, that we let go of outcome, that we enter the flow of life without constant calculation. The invitation, then, is not to suppress the mind, but to reorient it. Instead of using thought to control, we use it to explore. Instead of using it to predict, we use it to reflect. The mind becomes a tool for dialogue with the unconscious, not a dictator over it. We begin to engage in what Jung called active imagination, where we meet the inner figures of the psyche, not with judgment or dominance, but with curiosity and openness. We listen instead of analyze. We feel instead of fix. We allow life to shape us, instead of trying to shape life. Control will always tempt the wounded parts of us, the parts that were once powerless and now seek mastery. But healing does not come from mastery. It comes from integration, from allowing all parts of ourselves to have a voice. The frightened child within us must be heard, not silenced by a barrage of thoughts. The anxious part must be comforted, not dominated by intellectual rigidity. The overthinking mind must be understood for what it is. A protector, yes, but one who must eventually step aside so that a deeper wisdom can emerge. The self does not demand perfection or certainty. It demands wholeness. And wholeness arises not through control, but through surrender to the unknown depths of who we are becoming. The modern mind, overstimulated and burdened by the constant influx of information, rarely experiences silence. Yet within this silence lies a forgotten medicine, one that Carl Jung subtly pointed toward in his reflections on the unconscious and the path toward individuation. Stillness is not merely the absence of noise, it is the psychic space in which the deeper truths of the self can emerge. When the surface mind is active, buzzing with plans, questions, regrets, and future predictions, there is little room for the voice of the unconscious to speak. But in quiet, that deeper voice, the one that comes not from the ego but from the soul, begins to stir. Overthinking is not just the mind in motion, it is the soul in exile. To return from that exile, one must learn the art of inner stillness. Stillness is not a passive state, but a receptive one. It requires courage because it brings us into contact with all that we have avoided through constant mental activity. In silence, we may begin to hear the unresolved grief, the shadowed fear, the unloved aspects of the self that have been buried beneath the layers of cognitive noise. Jung wrote that only in silence do we come to ourselves, a truth that echoes across the spiritual and psychological traditions. The silence he spoke of is not void, but fullness, a fullness of presence, of receptivity, of listening. In that listening, the symbols of the unconscious rise. Images, intuitions, bodily sensations, and emotional truths that cannot be accessed through thought alone. This kind of stillness is not easily embraced, especially in a culture that worships speed, productivity, and certainty. To slow down, to be still, is to confront the parts of oneself that the ego has meticulously managed and hidden. But these parts, though painful or uncomfortable, are essential to our wholeness. Overthinking keeps them at bay. It distracts, dissects, and deflects. Silence, on the other hand, invites them in. It offers a kind of psychic containment where the fragmented self can begin to reunite. This is not an intellectual process, but an alchemical one. Jung's depth psychology always pointed toward transformation, not through external achievement, but through inner integration. Stillness becomes the crucible in which this transformation takes place. Many fear stillness because it exposes the vulnerability beneath the facade of control. The overactive mind convinces us that we are managing life effectively, when in truth we are avoiding life's raw immediacy. Stillness asks us to be with life as it is, unfiltered, imperfect, and mysterious. It requires us to surrender the need to know and instead enter into communion with what is. This is where the archetype of the self, the totality of the psyche, can begin to guide us. Not through logical steps, but through resonance, synchronicity, and inner alignment. Stillness is how the self speaks, but it cannot speak over the roar of obsessive thought. Developing a relationship with stillness is a practice of deep trust. It involves allowing the mind to rest, even when it feels unsafe to do so. It requires us to learn that silence is not a void to be feared, but a space of sacred potential. In this space, we may begin to hear the subtle longings of the soul, the parts of us that want to create, to feel, to love, to belong. To belong, these longings are not accessible through analysis. They come through presence. The quieter we become, the more clearly we hear them. And in hearing them, we begin to remember who we are beneath the persona we show the world. The journey into stillness is not linear. The mind will resist, often violently. Thoughts will arise with greater force at first. Memories will surface. Doubts will intrude. But these are not failures. They are invitations. Each interruption is a doorway into greater self-awareness. The work is not to suppress thought, but to observe it with compassion and gently return to presence. Over time, the psyche learns that it is safe to rest, that it does not need to be in constant motion to survive. This safety opens the door to healing. Stillness also reconnects us to the body, the place where the unconscious lives. While thought keeps us in abstraction, the body grounds us in reality. Breath, heartbeat, sensation, these are the rhythms that remind us we are alive. In stillness, we begin to feel again, not just emotionally, but somatically. And feeling is the foundation of healing. Jung understood that the psyche is not just mind, it is also soul and body. Overthinking cuts off this wholeness. Stillness restores it. Through cultivating stillness, we begin to see that much of what we sought through mental control was already within us. Peace was never something to be achieved through more thought. It was something to be remembered in the quiet. The psyche is inherently self-healing when given the conditions to do so. Stillness provides those conditions. It becomes the space where the fractured parts of the self return home. Not because the mind figured everything out, but because we finally stopped long enough to listen. In that listening, the ego softens, the heart opens, and the soul begins to speak again. Overthinking is not a failure of intelligence, but a cry from the soul, an attempt to manage the unmanageable, to find safety in certainty, and to shield oneself from the vulnerability of simply being. Through the lens of Jungian psychology, we come to understand that this mental spiraling is not merely a habit to be broken, but a symbol to be interpreted, a shadow to be integrated, and ultimately, a doorway to greater wholeness. Each loop of thought, each restless analysis, reveals a deeper longing. The longing to be known, to feel safe, to make meaning of suffering, and to reclaim connection with the self. Carl Jung showed us that true healing does not come from silencing the mind by force, but from listening to what the mind is trying to protect us from. Behind every anxious question lies an unmet emotion. Behind every compulsive analysis lies a fear the ego has not yet dared to face. And behind every fear lies a wounded part of the psyche calling out for integration, not rejection. To walk the path of individuation, the process of becoming whole, we must turn inward, not to fix ourselves, but to finally meet ourselves. The journey out of overthinking begins not with more control, but with surrender. Surrender to the mystery of our own depths. Surrender to the intelligence of the unconscious. Surrender to the sacred unknown, where the ego loses its grip and the self begins to guide. Stillness, presence, emotional honesty, and symbolic awareness are the tools we are called to reclaim, not as quick fixes, but as lifelong companions on the journey home to our true nature. In embracing this path, we do not become less thoughtful, we become more conscious. We begin to think with the whole psyche, not just the surface mind. We learn to hold contradiction, to tolerate ambiguity, and to live from a place of soulful awareness rather than compulsive reaction. This is the essence of Jungian healing, not the pursuit of perfection, but the embodiment of wholeness, and in that wholeness, the mind no longer needs to overthink, for the soul has been heard.